darkmyths.org and Neapolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. Welcome to episode 166 of the Lone Gunman Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Clark, and today we go back to New Orleans. November 25th, to be exact. The day after Lee Harvey Oswald was shot on live television. A scrawny, weird-looking fellow who appeared to be somewhat of an alcoholic, a private investigator by nature, walked into the FBI headquarters in New Orleans, Louisiana, and proceeded to tell his tale. Jack Martin of 1311 North Pryor Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, advised that he was listening to a TV program reporting the life of Lee Harvey Oswald and reporting various interviews with people in New Orleans that were acquainted with Lee Oswald. Martin stated that one of these people interviewed, whose name he does not know, who he described as a white male in his early 20s, wearing horn-rimmed glasses, recalled that Oswald had been active in the Civil Air Patrol with David Ferrie. Martin stated that when he had heard this, he flipped. Martin advised that in his occupation as a private investigator, he has had occasion to develop considerable information about Ferrie and reported it to Richard E. Roby, Special Agent, Investigative Division, Officer of Compliance and Security of the Federal Aviation Agency in Washington, D.C., who must have a big file on Ferrie, as they conducted a complete investigation of his activities in New Orleans several years ago. Martin advised that he called WWL TV station and furnished the station with background information about Ferrie, particularly his homosexual tendencies, and the fact that he formerly operated the Civil Air Patrol. He also told them that Ferrie was an amateur hypnotist, and that it was his idea that Ferrie may have hypnotized Lee Oswald and planted a post-hypnotic suggestion of assassination that he kill the president. Now that's a little much there. Martin also stated that he has visited in the home of David Ferrie, and he saw a group of photographs of various Civil Air Patrol cadet groups, and in this photograph he is sure he saw several years ago a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald as a member of one of its classes. Now this is interesting because it is true. It exists. It is out there today. And in fact, I came across an article the other day about the show PBS Frontline, where they managed to find a second photo in which David Ferrie and Lee Oswald were conferring in, but it has never seen the light of day. He alleges Ferrie could have taught Oswald to purchase a foreign-made firearm by mail order, or possibly have purchased a gun that was shown on television. He stated that he has seen similar type weapons at Ferrie's home when he visited there 2 years ago. Martin advised that Ferrie discussed with him the charges of crimes against nature, which resulted in his arrest by Jeff Parish authorities, and he recalled that Ferry had told him that one of the kids that was a witness against him had moved to Mississippi from New Orleans and subsequently joined the United States Marine Corps. He heard on television that Oswald had been in the Marine Corps, therefore he surmised Oswald was that kid. Now we know Oswald never moved to Mississippi, but going on, that he was a witness against Ferry in the crime against nature that had joined the Marine Corps. Martin explained it might have been the same individual or a very close coincidence. Martin advised that he has reported this matter to Major Trosclair of the New Orleans Police Department Intelligence Division, and he felt that Major Trosclair was not giving the matter sufficient concern, so he called Assistant DA Herman Coleman, who was a former newspaper reporter, and who was very familiar with the Ferry case as he had written various feature stories about Ferry. Martin stated that he explained all of his ideas and suspicions to Coleman. Martin advised that he was really suspicious of Ferry's activities when he received a report of W. Hardy Davis, a New Orleans bail bondsman, who told him that G. Ray Gill, a New Orleans attorney and employer of Ferry, had called him to locate Ferry, who lives down the street from him, and at the same time had denied to the TV station that Ferry was an employee of Gill's office. Davis furnished Martin information that Ferry had left town for Texas on Friday evening, November 22nd, which information he also made available to Mr. Coleman. Martin stated that Ferry is a completely disreputable person, a notorious sex deviant with a brilliant mind, being highly trained in mathematics, science, foreign language. Martin advised that Ferry had been educated in a seminary and subsequently expelled from the Catholic Church. And he, Martin, suspected him of being capable of committing any type of crime. Martin stated that he felt Ferry's possible association with Lee Oswald should be the subject of a close examination, as he personally believed that he could be implicated in the killing of President Kennedy. Now, this, of course, was the impetus of bringing David Ferry in for questioning by the FBI. On November 25th, they acted on this information fairly quickly, and after questioning Ferry, decided that he could be cleared and was not involved. And this, of course, this little bits of information and the FBI zeroing in on Ferry so quickly is what led Jim Garrison and his investigation to focus on David Ferry and the plot, or being a plotter in the assassination of President Kennedy, along with Clay Shaw. Now, in very late 1966, when Garrison was trying to figure out whether or not he should pursue things with the New Orleans angle of the assassination of President Kennedy, Pershing Gervais sat down in the office of Lou Ivon, who was the investigator for the district attorney's office, and interviewed Jack Martin on December the 13th, 1966. And they explain that they are doing this in the Fontainebleau Motor Hotel, and that they have a radio transmitter and a tape recorder hooked up and will be used in this interview of Jack Martin. This interview will be of Jack Martin in the effort to gain more information and knowledge of David William Ferry. The interview will be conducted by Pershing Gervais in room 125 of the Fontainebleau, and I, Louis Ivon, will be in room 119 recording the interview. This interview is for the purpose of gaining additional information on David Ferry, as Jack Martin in the past has given us information on David Ferry in connection with Lee Harvey Oswald. The time is 12:35 p.m. Okay. Martin starts off this interview saying, okay, first, I have some names you might like to write down. Names of people that have complete files on David Ferry, and I refer to these people along the way in the lines of conversation. Richard Roby is an investigator for the Office of Compliance and Security, Federal Aviation Division in Washington, D.C. Anything I tell you, he will be able to affirm it. There's a local cat around who is mixed up in a narcotics deal, and he has been pardoned, and he is Ferry's godson. You could probably sweat him out. His name is Morris Brownlee. He plays with a bunch of queers in the quarter. What does he do? Gervais asked. Well, I don't know what the hell this man does. I don't think Morris knows what Morris does. He could be making LSD right now. Gervais says, Brownlee? Martin, yeah, that's right. He has that kind of ability? Oh, yeah, absolutely. He is studying to be a medical doctor. He went to medical school. He got booted when busted by the narcotics squad, and he has been pardoned on it. These people are worried he has a hell of a chemical laboratory in his home. Where does he live? I don't know. I could probably look in the phone book. There's only 3 or 4 Brownlees in the book. Morris Brownlee, that's right. And Morris Brownlee is David Ferry's godson. Yes, that's right. So then they ask him a little bit about Morris Brownlee, where he met him, and yada, yada, yada. And then we get down to Regis Kennedy. And they say Regis investigated Bird's, connection with the Jack Rubies with the Oswald case. A man who can find Ferry and Oswald right here in this city is Kenny Arthus. Arthus, the old man who's erratical. He calls up the radio station and talks about the dirty deals. You know the old man who got out the monkey picture against Dowling, located at 520 Camp Street around Lafayette Square? He does nothing. He's retired. He just copies the Nazi newspapers and fights aggression. Gervais says, well, he sounds like a nut. Martin says, yes, he is. Gervais says, well, how can you believe what he says? Martin says, well, Lee Harvey Oswald had offices right next door to Jimmy Hodges. Gervais says, they maintained an office? Martin, they got one right up in the Newman building, the address on Camp Street. How come they never came out? And how come blank didn't get it? Martin says, what the hell? I don't know if they went up there or not. But Jimmy Arthus has all of Oswald's paraphernalia up there, and Lee Harvey Oswald used to hang out his banners with this asshole Ferry. Ferry had a whole bunch of guns, foreign-made guns he ordered from these mail-order deals, and Lee Harvey Oswald learned how to order his guns that way. I told that to Regis Kennedy. From Ferry, Gervais says. Martin says, that's right. Ferry was in Dallas when Lee Harvey Oswald was, and he lied about it, and he knew he lied about it. He had his Stinson Voyager airplane in Dallas. Gervais says, he had what? Martin says, his Stinson Voyager in Dallas. Gervais says, what is that? Martin says, it's his airplane. Gervais said, how could you be sure he had his plane in Dallas? Martin says, I know he had his plane in Dallas because I used to keep track of the son of a bitch because he was cutting his rope. Whatever that means. So then he goes on and says, I had met David Ferry casually through some Cubans. He says, yes, that's right. Through Sergio Arcacha Smith, Ph.D., Columbia University, fairly well, formerly with the Cuban Diplomatic Service. He headed the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front. He was living in New Orleans, out by the lakefront somewhere. And then he says, they got his wife and kids. Then he goes on to say, Martin says, Carlos Quiroga was there, incidentally. Quiroga? Gervais says. Martin says, yeah, he's related to Vic Shiro. He's married to one of the girls in the Shiro family. Gervais says Quiroga and spells it out. Martin says, yeah, he was formerly an electrical engineer in Cuba. Quiroga? Gervais says, yeah. His father is still in St. Thomas prison. So anyway, that's Quiroga's file. So Arcacha introduced you to him? Yeah. Where was this meeting at? In the St. Charles. In the coffee shop of the St. Charles. So anyway, Arcacha tells me, and I don't trust this guy, Ferry speaks a good bit of Spanish. So they go through. It says Arkasha knew him. I had met Ferry casually several times. Then he got up in St. Charles Motel and he'd talk about communism and Castro. Ferry did. This is before he got knocked off in the queer operation. He was talking about communism and Cuban deal. I got along with him. I'm like El Gringo. I take the bitter and the sweet, but I know these guys and I agree with them. And anyway, when Lee Harvey Oswald was in here, he was like this. Real close? Oh, tight, man. Carlos Quiroga hated Ferry with a passion. He knew things about Ferry I had no idea about. Arkasha used to accept Ferry. Oh, he's a bastard, and he played FBI with them. He wouldn't talk to the bastards. So he's going in and talking all this stuff, and even brings up Carlos Quiroga. Interesting. For more on Carlos Quiroga, listen to the last few episodes of this show. So then they ask him where Ferry was living. He says on Athenia Drive at the time. It was highly publicized at the time. The story was written by Herman Coleman. Coleman went on the raid with them. He was there. He found all these foreign-made guns there, just like the one that killed President Kennedy. Now, between the time I met Ferry and this took place, he had known Lee Harvey Oswald intimately. Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly belonged to his non-existent Cap Squad. This is hearsay. I understand that Ferry's Cap Squadron had no official standing, and as far as the Cap was concerned, it was non-existent. Gervais says, now let me ask you this. How can you be sure that Ferry was intimately involved with Oswald? Well, from merely listening to them, I met Oswald at his house one time in Ferry's home in front of Ferry's mother, who is now dead. She died a very quick death, but I'll get into that later. So Gervais says, well, he introduced you to Lee Harvey Oswald in his house? Martin says, yes, I know it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and Brownlee was there too. Oh, Brownlee was there also. Absolutely. Brownlee used to go everywhere with them. With Brownlee, there was always a tall, skinny, colored guy by the name of Philip. His name is Philippe Phillips, and he used to pack a rod for Ferry. I don't know what that means. He packed a .38 pistol all the time. He drove Ferry almost everywhere he went, and this guy would be with Ferry. There's been several statements made about this guy being up in the book depository. This guy was supposed to be Ferry's airplane mechanic and this and that. This N-word was arrested here and held for 3 days. Ferry got me to get him released, and I forgot the N-word's name. I didn't even write it down. Wow. Well, that's an interesting tidbit. Not sure about the background on many of these black Texas school book depository employees, but it'd be interesting to know. He says he remembered Orleans Avenue is all I remember. I think the guy's first name was blank. Of course, the recorder didn't pick it up. It's been so long ago. And then I sent all this information to Rick Roby. All this crap I sent to Rick because he asked me when I visited him in Washington. He asked me to send him all this stuff, all documents. I even had formulas that Ferry had written out on the fluorine hydrate system of atomic energy, and this and that and other things. This guy was a brilliant bastard. Don't you kid yourself that he isn't. He bought himself a PhD from the University of Phoenix. Wow. So they asked me, okay, yeah, they bought a PhD. He says, hell yeah, you can buy 4 PhDs. And they asked him who he bought them through and this, that, and the other. I can't tell you how I know, but it's damn reliable. That Ferry was in Dallas, at least in Fort Worth, 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. I understand he was to fly 3 people from there to Laredo, Texas, either there or Matamoros, Mexico. That's all I know. I'll tell you who Akasha last worked for when he was here. Akasha worked for the public relations man in the Kigali building who handled Shiro's campaign for the mass race. All these things you're telling me, did you tell all this to Regis Kennedy? Part of it. Martin says, what are you looking for? Gervais says, a complete picture of the mystery of David Ferrie. Yeah, he's a mystery wrapped inside a puzzle in an enigma, or however that quote goes, from the movie. Now, Ferrie had become involved with Akasha Smith, Leighton Martins, and Gordon Novell on a raid pulled off on the munitions dump in Houma, Louisiana. The HSCA discovered that in the summer of '63, Novell, Martins, Ferrie, and others associated with New Orleans private investigator Guy Banister robbed a munitions bunker owned by the Schlumberger Company of Houma, Louisiana. The men took the stolen munitions to Banister's 544 Camp Street office. Novell claimed that the raid was not an illegal act, but arranged by the CIA as an official operation against Cuba, developed by the National Security Council with the blessing of JFK in November of '61. Novell lied to the FBI about the CIA's involvement in the Houma theft because he felt he was expected to lie about it. In a suit against Playboy for having published Jim Garrison's claim that Novell was with the CIA, Novell testified that Guy Banister and Sergio Akasha Smith worked under CIA operative David Atlee Phillips. In the same testimony, Novell admitted that he had known Clay Shaw since 1959. So, and the real kicker, folks, is that when David Ferrie was up against all these Eastern Airlines allegations and they were investigating him and he was, going to lose his job, he had to go to a hearing in, I believe it was Tampa or Miami, Florida. But his attorney was G. Ray Gill. He was accompanied and had letters written to Eastern Airlines on his behalf by Sergio Akasha Smith. Guy Banister also was in Florida, pleading to Eastern Airlines about David Ferrie's good character. So, it's quite clear that all these guys knew each other. I mean, quite clear. Ferrie worked with Banister at the same time he was employed by Gill. It was at 544 Camp Street that Lee Harvey Oswald may have kept company with Banister and Ferrie. The three men all frequented the Mancuso restaurant on the first floor. A part-time private investigator, David L. Lewis, told Garrison he was drinking coffee with Banister's secretary, Delphine Roberts, when Carlos Quiroga, here he pops up again, a Cuban exile involved in the Cuban Revolutionary Front, walked into the restaurant with a man he introduced as Lee Oswald. A few days later, Lewis said he entered Banister's office and found a meeting in progress involving Banister, Ferrie, Quiroga, Lee Oswald, and another person. Although the owner of 544 Camp Street, Sam Newen, told the HSCA that he had not rented office space to Oswald, former Banister undercover worker Dan Campbell told Jim DiEugenio in a 1994 interview that Oswald was assigned an office at 544 Camp Street in the summer of '63. Guy Banister's secretary, Delphine Roberts, told author Anthony Summers that at least once Oswald and Ferrie went together to a Cuban exile training camp near New Orleans for rifle practice. According to Roberts, Banister told her directly that Oswald was working with their office. Interesting. Very interesting. So getting down through. That's just a little bit more about. In 1978, Jack Martin told the HSCA that on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, he was having drinks with Guy Banister, when their discussion began to revolve around long-distance phone calls and politics. The two returned to Banister's infamous 544 Camp Street office, where they came to blows over Martin's offhand remark, "What are you going to do? Kill me like you all killed Kennedy?" Banister became furious and beat Martin with a pistol. Martin called the New Orleans police, but eventually refused to press charges. The incident may have even been the impetus for the interview with the FBI on November 25th. You think? Now, HSCA records released in 1993 revealed a flight plan. HSCA RG 233 dated April the 8th, 1963. The flight plan names the pilot as Ferry, who was flying these three passengers named Heidel, Lambert, and Diaz from New Orleans to Garland, Texas. This would appear to be a very important document linking Ferry, Oswald, in parentheses Heidel, and Shaw, in parentheses Lambert, though it was never mentioned in the Shaw trial. On November the 8th, 1978, the HSCA interviewed Garrison and asked him about this remarkable document. He was asked if the document came from his files, and he merely said that he believed that it had. The only other comments he had about the flight plan was that it looked quite credible, but he and his investigators were unable to determine if it was genuine. Of course, Shaw and Ferry denied knowing each other. Then it goes on to talk about some of the alleged photos of Shaw and Ferry together. Back to David Lewis for a minute. On January 21st, 1967, Pelham and I were in the DA's office and photographed David Lewis as he observed through a backless mirror Carlos Quiroga. Lewis positively identified Quiroga as the man he saw on 3 occasions in late '62 in the company of Lee Harvey Oswald. We photographed Quiroga through the mirror. Afterwards, Pelham, myself, Lewis, and John Voss of the DA's office went to a restaurant for lunch. I interviewed Lewis concerning both the alleged gunshot fired at him on January 20th and about the 3 times he saw Quiroga and Oswald. Lewis said he was walking in the vicinity of St. Louis and Chartres Streets the previous night about 6 p.m. His route, his location, and the time were all random matters. He said a car, which he later described as a green '61 Ford, drove past, and the driver leaned out the window and shouted, "Louie." He said that's his nickname. He turned and saw a chrome-plated gun, probably a .25 caliber, pointed at him and heard a shot. He says there were no witnesses that he knows of. He says he first saw Quiroga and Oswald in the summer of '62, when he was seated in Mancuso's restaurant with Delphine Roberts. Quiroga came to the table, said hello to both, and introduced a stranger with him as Lee Harvey. Lewis, a few days later, saw the pair on the second floor of the Newman building, but no conversation ensued. About 2 weeks later, he saw them again in Banister's office with Banister, Arcacha Smith, and another unidentified man present. Lewis says he is confident these meetings occurred prior to '63 because his wife had a child in January of '63, and he fulfilled a promise to her that never again to associate with Banister. And has remained silent on the matter until December of '66 when called into Garrison's office. At the time, he says, I racked my memory and I remember the incidents. And this is from Chandler. Now, early, I found this file from January 4th of 66. And it's a statement of David F. Lewis Jr. And it's from the Office of the District Attorney, Parish of New Orleans, State of Louisiana. Say that 50,000 times fast. Okay. Officer Ivan called me into this office to look at some photographs. This I did on my own free will, and upon my observation of 4 photographs shown to me, marked on the backside 1 through 4 by Officer Ivan, did determine that I recognized figure number 2 as being Lee Harvey Oswald. Figure number 3, name is unknown, but I have seen him with David Ferry and Arkasha Smith. In photograph number 1, figure number 3 was first observed by me with Arkasha Smith on the corner of Poydras and Camp Streets at one unknown date as I was proceeding towards 601 Camp. Figure number 3 may have been one of the 2 men at David Ferry's house on my one visit there with Mr. Martin, Mr. Newborough, and Carlos Quiroga. I'm not certain of this. I was requested to initial and date the 4 photographs shown to me, in which I did. Photograph marked number 1 on the back of the photograph of 5 subjects. On the front, marked from left to right 1 through 5. Above their heads by Officer Ivan, I have placed by initials and dates above the heads of the 2 subjects I recognized. Interesting. And then we get into the interview of Leander Davey of Opelousas, Louisiana. He is a retired Air Force colonel, possibly. Now, this is done by HSCA investigators, my guys, Bob Burris and L.J. Delsa. December 16th, 1977. They met him at the Greyhound bus station in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mr. Davey was interviewed that day in room 65 of the Patio Motel located on Tulane Avenue in NOLA. Mr. Davey was shown approximately 60 photographs and asked to identify those that he knew. He identified the following photographs as people that seemed familiar to him, but that he cannot remember anything specific about. These were Lindito Rachante, Miguel Mariano Cruz, Roy Hargraves, there's a name we know, Gordon Novell, there's another name we know, John Meadows, William Brady, Norberto Fernandez, Leonard Wally, Florencio Villara, and Roberto Cortez. And the following people were identified by photograph that Mr. Davey positively remembered as having seen them around the court of the Two Sisters restaurant located at Royal Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. This restaurant and bar has an entrance in the 600 block of Bourbon Street also. Mr. Davey worked as a doorman at this entrance from 61 to 63. So these people identified that he positively remembers seeing around the court of the Two Sisters. They are Harold Sandoz Jr., Jose Mauro Pepe, David Ferry, Sergio Arcacha Smith, Thomas Beckham, Clay Shaw, Lawrence Howard, Fred Lee Chrisman, and Jack Ruby. Now there is an interesting group of fellows. Mr. Davey also knows Mr. Eugene Davis, but the investigators did not have a photograph of him at the time. Mr. Davey also identified Lee Harvey Oswald and the first and second tramps as having been in his company. Gene Davis was the manager, Margaret Tannenbaum was the bookkeeper, and Nick Carno was the owner of the Court of Two Sisters. As the doorman on Bourbon Street, Mr. Davey did not see the customers in the patio or restaurant or oyster bar. He did see people occasionally in the front bar. Now, what's interesting about this name is Eugene Davis. This is the man who, what is his name? It'll come to me. Hang on. Yes, Dean Andrews. This is the name that Dean Andrews claimed to be Clay Bertrand after he was dogged by Jim Garrison, and he kept saying that Clay Shaw was not Clay Bertrand. This is the man, he said, was going by the name of Clay Bertrand, this Eugene Davis. And it's interesting that this Mr. Davey, who was the doorman here at this restaurant, he remembers seeing David Ferry, Arcacha Smith, Beckham, Shaw, Howard, Chrisman, and Ruby at this restaurant. Very interesting. The investigators talked to Eugene Davis several times during October and November of '77. He is cordial and states that he is willing to help in their investigation. He was not interviewed, but in general conversation he denied or ever having seen Lee Harvey Oswald. He does not know anything about Clay Shaw and cannot understand why Andrews named him as Clay Bertrand. Gene Davis now owns Wanda's Bar, located at Iberville Street in the French Quarter. This bar is a homosexual hangout. Eugene Davis stated that there were rooms above the court of the Two Sisters patio, but they were used as storerooms, and Nick Carno had an apartment up there that no one would use except Carno. As stated above, Gene Davis denies knowing Clay Shaw or Lee Harvey Oswald or anything about their activities. He also denies knowing Jack Martin. In an interview with Thomas Beckham on November 8, '77, the reporting investigators were told that Eugene Davis attended parties with Shaw, Beckham, Ferry, and Martin in David Ferry's apartment. Beckham was asked to get phony degrees and certificates for Gene Davis in '63. He did and gave them to Jack Martin to give to Gene Davis. The investigators will speak with Mr. Davis further, and any additional information will be reported. Sounds to me, folks, that Mr. Davis is not being entirely truthful. Now, Mr. Davey worked only at night and was paid in cash by manager Gene Davis, $10 a night. One night, while he was working the door, a young man that he later realized was Lee Harvey Oswald came up to him and asked him if he knew where Clay Bertrand was. Davey replied that he did not know and inquired of Mrs. Margaret Tannenbaum if anyone by that name worked in the place. Gene Davis was standing nearby and told Davey that he would speak with the young man. Oswald and Davis then went into the restaurant for a little while. Later, as Oswald was leaving, Davey heard Gene Davis tell a waitress, "See that young man there? He just returned from behind the Iron Curtain." That was the first time that Davey saw Oswald. He cannot put a time or date to this meeting. Now, the second time that Davey saw Oswald was sometime nearer to November of '63. Davey missed Gene Davis the night before and did not get paid. He went to the Court of Two Sisters in the day, sometime after noon, and asked where he could find Gene Davis. A waiter told him that Gene Davis was in the storeroom. The waiter had to tell Davey how to get to the storeroom because he had never been there before. Davey went into the restaurant and up a spiral staircase and onto a porch that was on the second floor of a building that ran alongside of the patio where customers ate. He walked to the last two doors near the Bourbon Street side, and he knocked on the door, and someone said, "Come in." He walked into the room from the Bourbon Street side and saw Gene Davis in that room with Oswald laying on an iron-posted bed wearing black pants. David Ferry was looking out of a window towards the back of the rooms. Ferry was sitting on the bed as if they had been talking and stopped when he came in. To his left was another room, and through the door he could see that it was a kitchen. And there were two army-type cots set up with covers on them, as if someone was using them as beds. In this room he saw two Americans. The man he saw best looked like the photograph of the first tramp. The other man looked like the second tramp. No one except Gene talked, and he only said, "See you later." That was the only other time that he saw Oswald. Davy stated that Oswald looked different the second time. He couldn't elaborate any further on the description, but he insisted that he looked a little different. Mr. Davy stated that he had seen Ferry around there 4 or 5 more times, and he usually had a Cuban guy with him when he came there. He never saw who Ferry talked to because of his position out front. He only saw him come in and leave. Now, Jose Pepe Mayoral was the head waiter and is now back in Miami, Florida. Pepe was good friends with Harold Sandoz Jr. Mr. Davy would take Jose Mayoral and Harold Sandoz around to the Cuban bars on Decatur Street after they got off work. The place they would go to that he can remember best is the Casa de las Marinas, located at 601 Decatur Street. He also seems to remember the Las Americas as a place they went. It is located in the 400 block of Decatur Street. Davy remembers seeing Sergio Arcacha Smith, Thomas Beckham, and Clay Shaw, but never talked to them, and cannot put them together in the business. He identifies the photo of Fred Lee Chrisman as a man that came around almost every week in 1963. And Gene Davis used to introduce him as my daddy in a joking manner. Maybe not. Chrisman said that he was from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Davy did not remember the name. He only recognized the face. He said that he remembered Fred Chrisman had a white car, and he used to park it in the no parking zone in front of the entrance and would give Davy $4 or $5 for watching it for him. One night a car parked in the zone with a Texas license tag, and he went to the street side and politely told the driver that this was a restricted zone. The driver unpolitely slapped him in the face and laughed at him and then drove off. He heard the girl on the passenger side ask, "Why did you do that, Jack?" He could not remember what the other people in the car looked like, and he states that this was the only time that he saw the guy, and when he saw photos of Jack Ruby, he recognized him as the guy that slapped him. Mr. Davy stated that he called Mr. Garrison in '67 and took a trip to New Orleans and told him about the above-related incident involving Oswald and Clay Bertrand. He did not tell Mr. Garrison about the upstairs meeting because he was afraid at the time. At that time, he took a polygraph examination administered by the DA's office and passed, and would do the same again for this investigation. He was not called to testify in the Clay Shaw trial. Now, Eugene Davis, of course, as I said, was named by New Orleans attorney Dean Andrews as the Clay or Clem Bertrand that called him on November 22nd and asked him to represent Lee Oswald in Dallas. Then DA Jim Garrison charged and convicted Dean Andrews for perjuring himself when he testified before the Orleans grand jury for identifying Davis as Bertrand. Dean Andrews testified before the Warren Commission and claimed not to know who the man was that retained him to represent Oswald. The owner of the Court of Two Sisters, Nick Carno, is a close associate of Carlos Marcello, and is alleged to have his names on businesses in the French Quarter that are actually Marcello's. So Nick Carno is basically a frontman and presently fighting trial dates which his attorneys have been successfully putting off since Carno was indicted by the Orleans Parish Grand Jury for murder in '74. Wow. All right. Now we get into a little interview of William Dalzell by our buddies L.J. Delsa and Bob Burris. Date, January 26th, 1978. He states that before the Bay of Pigs, he was employed as a private investigator for a firm under the name of Jack Martin, Newbrough, and Dalzell. So apparently Jack Martin, Joe Newbrough, And this William Dalzell, who was CIA, had a quote-unquote investigation firm. They did a lot of routine private investigation work, such as divorce cases and things of that nature. He further states that he started an organization called the Friends of Democratic Cuba, and that Guy Banister was asked to be on their board of directors along with Alfred Chittenden. And the reason for this was that he wanted to make sure that any monies collected were put to their proper use. He said he used to visit a restaurant, Jack Mancuso, and a bar and grill known as the Katzenjammer, along with Guy Banister. He also stated that Mr. K, who had an office in the Masonic building, who identified himself as a CIA agent, asked him to furnish information relative to any Cuban communication systems that he was able to uncover. He said that on occasions that he did go into the Masonic building. He couldn't remember exactly which office, but he felt that it was above the offices of the FBI, and he did give this Mr. K certain information he obtained. He said that he left New Orleans sometime in 62 or 63 before the assassination. He also stated that there was considerable activity in the area around the Bolter building and 544 Camp Street, but he couldn't identify any offices or office that was the center of this activity. He knew Arkasha Smith had his office over the FDC office in the Bolter building. He was shown photographs, and he identified the following photographs by numbers: 5, 7, 13, 16, 23, 26, 8. States he has seen them in the area but doesn't know them. With regard to Carlos Brunier, he said Carlos helped them to obtain blood and clothing. For further information, the memo submitted by Delsa and Buras should be reviewed. Wow. Now, in February of 61, Banister was conducting background investigations of the members of the CRC from a list provided by Arkasha Smith. In early of 62, both moved their offices to the Newman building, which carried the two addresses for the two streets it faced, 531 Lafayette and 544 Camp. Jack Martin, a private investigator associated with Banister, may also have been contacted by Ferry for assistance on this case. Ferry testified in August of 63 that he had helped Martin on a case involving a phony religious order in Louisville, Kentucky in November of 61, and later Martin wrote letters to the FAA and Eastern Airlines on Ferry's behalf. So, if Martin did this, that people always say, well, he might have had a bone to pick with David Ferry. That's why he outed him to the FBI with no real proof or anything. But, it seems that they had known each other and were possibly friends at some point. And with this assistance, Ferry was able to resolve many of his difficulties. At the end of February 62, Ferry was tried and acquitted of the charges of extortion. The other charges were NOLA prosequid in November of 62, and I probably did not pronounce that right, but that's okay. And this all comes out of the Eastern Airlines debacle with David Ferry. I mean, according to Carlos Quiroga, a Cuban who had been involved with the CRC, Ferry often provided Arkasha Smith with funds, stating Ferry lent him money when he needed it for his family. He, Ferry, had $100 bills around all the time, even after he had lost his job with the airlines. That's interesting information. Carlos Quiroga, FBI informant. I mean, you could go on and on and on with this stuff, but what does it all mean, and who can we trust, and what is true? I mean, I don't know. Evidence indicates that Ferry conducted his own investigation into the Kennedy assassination. Oswald's former landlady in New Orleans, Mrs. Jessie James Garner, told the committee that, as she recalls, David Ferry visited her home on the night of the assassination and asked about Oswald's library card. Mrs. Garner stated that she refused to talk to David Ferrie. Wow. Ferrie also talked with several former members of the Civil Air Patrol in an attempt to find out if any former cadets recalled Lee Harvey Oswald and Ferrie's squadron. Among those contacted was a former cadet, Roy McCoy, who told the FBI that Ferrie had come by looking for photographs of the cadets to see if Oswald was pictured in any of the photos with David Ferrie. Insane. Now, apparently, Guy Banister was very angry with James Arthus and Sam Newman over Oswald's use of the 544 Camp Street address on his handbills. The committee questioned Sam Newman regarding Robert's allegation. That would be Delphine. Newman could not recall ever seeing Oswald or renting a space to him. He did recall, however, asking a young man who was in the office once used by the CRC to leave. Newman did not think that this person was Oswald, but it could have been. Newman theorized that if Oswald was using the 544 Camp Street address and had any link to the building, it would have been through a connection to the CRC or Banister's office. The committee questioned other individuals once affiliated with Guy Banister, including Joseph Newborough, investigators who had worked with Banister in 1963, Mary Helen Bringle, one of two secretaries in Banister's office from approximately June of 1963 to December of 1963, Louise Decker, a secretary in Banister's office from 1961 to 1962, Joe Oster, one-time partner of Banister's who set up his own private detective agency, and Carlos Quiroga. This guy keeps popping up. The Cuban exile who visited Oswald at his home on August 16, 1963, endeavoring to learn more about this Fair Play for Cuba committee. Quiroga told the committee he frequently visited Banister's office and Mancuso's coffee shop, and individuals recalled seeing Oswald at 544 Camp Street. Several witnesses recommended that the committee speak with Jack Martin or Delphine Roberts since they were in most contact with Banister. Martin and Roberts have both been interviewed by the committee on several occasions. Roberts, who initially refused to speak with the committee staff, told the committee she was very active in anti-communist activities in the early 60s. She said she worked with Banister as a volunteer, typing correspondence, making files, and clipping newspapers because Banister was working for what Roberts believed in. Roberts claimed Banister had an extensive file on communists and fellow travelers, including one on Lee Harvey Oswald, which was kept out of the original files because Banister never got around to assigning a number to it. Roberts does not remember what was in the file other than that it contained general information on Oswald, such as newspaper clippings. Roberts also related the incident described previously in this section in which Banister became angry over Oswald's use of the Camp Street address. Roberts gave the committee her version of an incident that took place late in the evening on the day of the assassination. She said Jack Martin came into the office and approached the area of the office where Banister struck Martin on the head, causing him to bleed. Both men then went into Banister's private office and continued their discussion beyond Roberts' earshot. During another interview, Roberts told the committee that Oswald came into the office seeking employment and sometime later brought Marina in with him. Contrary to her statements in the initial interview that she had never seen Oswald, she stated that she saw Oswald come into Banister's office on several occasions. Because of such contradictions in Roberts' statements to the committee and lack of independent corroboration of many of her statements, her reliability has not been determined. Now, a New Orleans police complaint filed by Jack Martin on November 22, 1963 corroborates Roberts' story insofar as it established Banister's assault against Jack Martin with the pistol. According to the report, Martin and Banister had been drinking at a neighboring bar, then visited Banister's office and became involved in various discussions about personal and political subjects. They then began to argue about unauthorized long-distance phone calls, which Banister accused Martin of making from his office. The discussion became more heated, and Banister pulled out a .357 Magnum revolver and hit Martin on the head 4 or 5 times with the butt of the gun. When Martin began to bleed, Banister I feel like I'm missing part of this, but Martin then went to Charity Hospital for treatment, returned home, and called the police to file this report. Martin refused to press charges as Banister was, quote, like a father to him. Martin was questioned by the committee regarding the incident and for information about Banister's office. Martin told the committee he was a part-time investigator and writer, as he was in the early 60s. Martin was one of the members of Banister's investigative, quote, pool, and was frequently in and out of Banister's office in 1963. Martin told the committee that on November 22, 1963, he was having drinks with Banister at a local bar and they got to an argument. They went to Banister's office, and in the heat of the quarrel, Banister said something, to which Martin replied, "What are you going to do, kill me like you all did Kennedy?" And Banister drew his pistol and beat Martin in the head. Martin believes Banister would have killed him, but for the intervention of Banister's secretary, who pleaded with Banister not to shoot Martin. It was the day after this incident that Martin related his suspicions about David Ferry to the New Orleans DA's office. Martin had at one time been a close associate of Ferry. Ferry told the FBI he met Martin in the fall of '61, not long after Ferry had started working for Carlos Marcello and after this Eastern Airlines debacle. So there you have it, folks. I mean, it's a twisted tale of interconnected personalities. Folks, you just can't deny the connections with. And a lot of seedy, underground, New Orleans type stuff going on. The question is, what can we believe? I mean, there's so much corroboration and similar versions of different tales from different people, but they all seem to mesh and make up this unruly quilted fabric of lies and deceit from the seedier side of New Orleans. Wow. Well, thank you folks for going on the journey with me. That was fascinating. And make sure you're checking out Quick Hits, an assassination news and notes podcast I did with my buddy Doug Campbell. Look out for a new episode dropping soon, featuring the one and the only Mr. Ted Rubenstein. That's right, you heard it here, folks. Ted will be on the show soon, so be on the lookout for that. To all you folks out there, stay safe, be smart, and enjoy your life, people. This is your boy. Peace.